Sarah Martinez had answered phones at the International Embassy for 8 years, her voice always professional, always pleasant, always speaking perfect English to every caller. What the ambassadors didn't know was that when the Korean delegation whispered threats in their native tongue, when the Russian attaché spoke coded instructions, when the Chinese officials discussed invasion timelines, she understood every single word. And on the day 12 nations gathered for what everyone believed would be routine trade negotiations, her ability to understand what they didn't want translated would be the only thing standing between diplomatic protocol and global war. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories about hidden expertise and the power of languages intrigue you, please consider subscribing to discover more accounts of the remarkable people who shape our world from behind the scenes. The International Embassy stood like a fortress of marble and glass in the heart of Geneva, its 37 floors housing diplomatic missions from every major nation on Earth. On the 15th floor, behind mahogany doors marked only with discreet brass nameplates, the most sensitive negotiations in human history unfolded daily. Trade agreements that could shift global economies, security pacts that redefined military alliances, cultural exchanges that either built bridges between civilizations or erected walls that lasted generations. And at the reception desk of the Diplomatic Relations Center, Sarah Martinez had sat for 8 years, managing appointments and answering phones with the same pleasant efficiency that had made her invisible to everyone who mattered. To the ambassadors, deputy ministers, and trade negotiators who passed her desk daily, she was simply part of the furniture, reliable, competent, and entirely forgettable. They knew she spoke excellent English, of course, and perhaps a bit of Spanish given her surname. What they didn't know was that Sarah held advanced degrees in linguistics from 4 different universities, spoke 12 languages with native-level fluency, and possessed an understanding of cultural psychology so sophisticated that she could predict diplomatic outcomes based on subtle changes in pronunciation and word choice. More importantly, they didn't know that her real name was Sarah Elena Vasquez Chen, and that she had been placed at the embassy 8 years ago by a joint intelligence task force whose existence was known to fewer than 40 people worldwide. Her mission was elegantly simple: listen, understand, and prevent. The intelligence community had learned, through decades of catastrophic miscommunications, that most international conflicts began not with military aggression or economic pressure, but with simple misunderstandings that escalated beyond anyone's ability to control them. A mistranslated phrase that implied an insult, a cultural reference that carried unintended historical baggage, a tone of voice that suggested disrespect when none was intended. Sarah's job was to identify these linguistic landmines before they exploded into diplomatic incidents. Over 8 years, she had quietly diffused 17 potential international crises, most of which never appeared in any official records because her interventions prevented them from reaching crisis level in the first place. She accomplished this through a combination of extraordinary linguistic ability and carefully cultivated invisibility. To everyone around her, she was simply the helpful receptionist who somehow always knew exactly which language services were needed, who could recommend the perfect restaurant for visiting dignitaries, and who had an uncanny ability to resolve scheduling conflicts that seemed impossible to untangle. What they experienced as helpful efficiency was actually sophisticated intelligence gathering. When she recommended that sushi restaurant to the Japanese delegation, she was ensuring they would be in a comfortable cultural environment that would put them in a cooperative mood for afternoon negotiation. When she rescheduled the German trade minister's meeting to avoid conflict with lunch, she was actually preventing him from negotiating while hungry, a condition that her psychological profiles had identified as making him 34% more likely to reject reasonable proposals. And when she answered the phone in perfect English, then seamlessly switched to flawless Mandarin, fluent Arabic, or native-level Russian depending on the caller's preference, she was demonstrating a level of cultural competence that made foreign dignitaries unconsciously more trusting of the entire diplomatic process. But Sarah's most important work happened in the spaces between official conversations, when delegates thought no one important was listening, when they spoke freely in their native languages, assuming the pleasant receptionist couldn't possibly understand their private concerns, their real negotiating positions, or their government's actual instructions. This Tuesday morning in November began like any other. Sarah arrived at 7:30 a.m., reviewed overnight communications from 12 different intelligence feeds in 8 languages, and prepared comprehensive briefing notes that she would never officially deliver to anyone. Her daily routine included monitoring real-time translation software in 14 languages, scanning international news sources for cultural and political developments that might affect ongoing negotiations, and maintaining detailed psychological profiles of every diplomat who regularly passed through the embassy. By the time the first officials arrived, Sarah had already identified 3 potential tension points for the day's negotiations. The Korean delegation was operating under time pressure due to a domestic political crisis they hadn't disclosed. The Russian representative was dealing with personal family stress that was affecting his judgment, and there was a significant translation error in the preliminary trade documents that would cause serious misunderstandings if not corrected. None of this information existed in any official briefing document. Sarah had gathered it through a combination of linguistic analysis, cultural psychology, and the kind of pattern recognition that came from 8 years of invisible observation. The morning proceeded normally until 10:47 a.m., when the German trade minister's assistant approached her desk with unusual urgency. "Miss Martinez, I need to add 3 more delegations to this afternoon's trade session. The Director General wants to expand the discussion to include input from Korea, Japan, and Brazil." Sarah looked up from her computer screen, maintaining her pleasantly professional expression while her mind immediately began calculating the implication. The original session had been carefully structured for 9 participants representing the major European and North American economic powers. Adding 3 more nations, particularly Korea and Japan, who had historical tensions that required specific protocol management, would fundamentally change the negotiation dynamics. "Of course," she replied with a smile. "I'll arrange additional interpretation services and adjust the seating arrangements." But as she began making the necessary calls, Sarah realized something that made her pause. The addition of these 3 specific nations wasn't random. Korea and Japan represented the key Asian economic power. Brazil was the economic heart of South America. Combined with the existing European and North American participants, this afternoon's session would include representatives from every major economic region on Earth. This was no longer a routine trade negotiation. This was a global economic summit that had been disguised as a regional trade discussion. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. When governments disguised the true scope of international meetings, it usually meant they were dealing with issues too sensitive for public attention. Economic discussions involving every major global power could only mean one thing. There was a crisis that threatened the entire international financial system. She spent her lunch break accessing classified economic databases through secure channels that officially didn't exist. What she found confirmed her suspicions and added a terrifying new dimension to the afternoon's proceedings. Over the past 6 months, a coordinated series of cyber attacks had targeted the financial infrastructure of every major economy. The attacks were sophisticated enough to suggest state-level sponsorship, but their origin remained unknown. More concerning, the attacks weren't designed to steal money or gather intelligence. They were systematically testing the resilience of global financial networks, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited to crash the entire international economy. The afternoon's trade negotiation was actually an emergency session to coordinate a response to what intelligence agencies privately referred to as the most significant threat to global stability since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if Sarah's analysis was correct, at least one of the delegations attending the meeting was working for whoever was behind the attacks. As the afternoon session convened in Conference Room A, Sarah positioned herself at the reception desk where she could monitor the proceedings through discrete audio feeds. The official interpreters would handle the formal translations, but Sarah's real job was to listen for the things that weren't being officially translated. The session began with routine pleasantries in multiple languages. Ambassador Chen from China expressed gratitude for Swiss hospitality in fluent French. Minister Kowalski from Poland made a joke about Swiss chocolate in perfect German. Trade Representative Morrison from Canada commented on the beautiful weather in competent Italian. But Sarah noticed something the official interpreters missed. Each delegate was demonstrating linguistic competence slightly beyond what their official profiles suggested. These weren't routine courtesies. They were subtle demonstrations of intelligence-gathering capability. Everyone was showing everyone else that they were more sophisticated than they appeared. The real business began when the Korean delegate, speaking in English but occasionally consulting notes written in Korean, outlined what he described as concerning irregularities in international financial data flows. His presentation was technically accurate but deliberately vague. He was describing the cyber attacks without explicitly naming them. Sarah listened as Minister Nakamura from Japan responded in careful English, but twice made what appeared to be translation errors that actually conveyed additional information in Japanese that wasn't reflected in his English statement. He was communicating different information to the Korean delegation than to the rest of the room. When the Russian representative spoke, supposedly in English for universal comprehension, he occasionally inserted Russian phrases that the official interpreter translated as clarifications, but which actually contained substantive policy positions that differed from his official English statements. Within 30 minutes, Sarah realized that she was monitoring not one negotiation but multiple simultaneous conversations. Each delegation was communicating openly in English, while passing different information through carefully chosen phrases in their native languages. They were operating on the assumption that only the official interpreters would catch these linguistic layers, and that official interpreters were bound by strict neutrality protocol. They had no idea that the receptionist taking notes in the corner was fluent in all 12 languages being used and was trained to recognize exactly this kind of multilingual intelligence gathering. But the most disturbing discovery came when Sarah noticed that the Brazilian representative, who had been silent for most of the session, was taking notes that didn't correspond to anything being said in any language. He was documenting information that wasn't being shared publicly, which meant he was receiving it through private communication. Sarah discreetly activated advanced monitoring protocols and immediately identified the source. The Brazilian delegate was receiving real-time intelligence updates through a discrete earpiece connected to encrypted communications that were bypassing the embassy's security system. Someone was feeding him information about the other delegations' real positions, their government's actual instructions, and most critically, details about the cyber attacks that hadn't been shared with the group. The Brazilian delegate wasn't just representing his government. He was gathering intelligence for whoever was orchestrating the financial attacks. Sarah faced a decision that had no precedent in 8 years of operations. Her normal protocol was to gather intelligence and report through established channels, letting others determine appropriate responses. But this situation was evolving too rapidly for normal procedures. Every minute the session continued, the other delegations were unknowingly revealing more information to whoever was behind the attack. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the meeting reached the point where classified financial security measures would be discussed openly. Once that happened, whoever was coordinating the attacks would have everything they needed to execute whatever they were planning. Sarah stood up from her desk and walked into conference room A. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she entered the room where unauthorized personnel were strictly forbidden. The German trade minister looked confused. The Chinese ambassador appeared surprised. The Russian representative's expression was unreadable. "Forgive the interruption," Sarah said in perfect English, her voice maintaining the same pleasant professionalism she had used for 8 years. "There appears to be a technical issue with our security systems that requires immediate attention." Ambassador Chen responded in Mandarin, testing whether she would understand. "This is highly irregular. Who authorized your entry?" Sarah replied fluently in Mandarin, her pronunciation carrying the slight Beijing accent that indicated high-level education. "I understand your concern, Ambassador Chen. The technical issue involves unauthorized communications that may compromise the confidentiality of your discussion." The Korean delegate leaned forward and spoke in Korean, his tone sharp with suspicion. "How does a receptionist speak Mandarin like a diplomat?" "The same way she speaks Korean like a scholar," Sarah replied in flawless Korean, her grammar formal enough to indicate advanced academic training, "and Russian like a native, German like a professor, and 9 other languages, with equivalent fluency." The room fell completely silent. Sarah continued, switching smoothly between languages as she addressed each delegation directly. "To the Russians in Russian, your linguistic coding is sophisticated but not undetectable. To the Japanese in Japanese, your parallel communication strategy is elegant, but transparent to someone with appropriate training. To the Germans in German, your assumption that only official interpreters monitor multilingual conversations is incorrect." Minister Nakamura was the first to speak, his voice careful and controlled. In English he asked, "Who exactly are you?" "For 8 years I've been Sarah Martinez, your receptionist," she replied. "But my actual identity is Dr. Sarah Elena Vasquez Chen, specialized in multilingual intelligence analysis and international crisis prevention." The Brazilian delegate, who had been silent throughout the linguistic demonstration, suddenly stood up. "This meeting is compromised," he said in Portuguese, reaching for his briefcase. Sarah turned to him and responded in fluent Portuguese, with a slight São Paulo inflection. Yes, it is compromised, Minister Santos, but not by me. She gestured toward the discreet earpiece that had become visible when he stood. You've been receiving unauthorized communications throughout this session. Someone has been feeding you intelligence about the other delegation's positions, information that wasn't shared publicly. The German trade minister's face went pale. That's impossible. Your security protocols are excellent for preventing traditional surveillance. Sarah interrupted, switching to German. They're not designed to detect a delegate who's working for the entity you're trying to defend against. Minister Santos had gone completely still, his hand frozen halfway to his briefcase. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system seemed loud. Sarah continued in English, addressing the entire room. For the past 6 months, your respective governments have been dealing with sophisticated cyber attacks targeting global financial infrastructure. You've gathered here under the cover of trade negotiations to coordinate a response. But one of your delegations has been reporting your discussions to whoever is orchestrating the attacks. She turned back to Minister Santos. Your notes contain information that wasn't shared in any language during this session. You're receiving real-time intelligence through encrypted communications that bypass embassy security. And based on the timing of your updates, your source has access to classified financial data from at least 6 different governments. The Chinese ambassador leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. These are extremely serious accusations. They are, Sarah agreed, which is why I documented everything. She produced a small recording device from her pocket, then switched to Mandarin. Every unauthorized communication, every linguistic code, every piece of intelligence that shouldn't exist, then to Russian, all recorded with full linguistic analysis, then to Korean, and ready for immediate verification by your respective intelligence service. Minister Santos finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. You have no authority here. You're a receptionist. I'm a linguist with specialized training in international intelligence operations. Sarah replied calmly, and I've been authorized to prevent exactly this kind of situation for 8 years. She turned to address the other delegations. Minister Santos has been using this summit to gather intelligence for the same entity that's been attacking your financial system. Every detail of your response strategies has been compromised. The Korean delegate asked the obvious question. How do we know you're telling the truth? Sarah smiled slightly. Because in 30 seconds, Minister Santos is going to receive another communication on that earpiece, and it's going to contain instructions for ending this meeting before more information is revealed. She looked at her watch. 25 seconds. The room held its collective breath. At exactly the 25-second mark, Minister Santos's hand moved unconsciously toward his ear, then stopped when he realized everyone was watching. 15 seconds. Sarah said quietly. At exactly 15 seconds, Minister Santos stood abruptly. This meeting has become too irregular. I suggest we reconvene through official channels. There it is, Sarah said in Portuguese. Your instructions to terminate the session. The silence that followed was unlike anything in the embassy's history. 12 highly trained diplomats, each representing the interests of a major world power, were grappling with the realization that their most sensitive security discussions had been monitored by their enemy from the beginning. Ambassador Chen was the first to recover. In English he asked, "What do you recommend?" Sarah looked around the room at faces that no longer saw her as invisible furniture. I recommend that you continue your discussions, but in a secure location with properly screened participants. I can provide detailed analysis of the intelligence that's been compromised and suggest countermeasures for future communications. And Minister Santos, asked the German trade minister. Minister Santos will be detained by Swiss security while your governments determine appropriate charges. Sarah replied. His communications equipment will be analyzed by a joint intelligence team, and the source of his instructions will be traced. She turned to the Brazilian delegate, who had been standing frozen since his instructions were exposed. Minister Santos, your cooperation in identifying your handlers will determine whether this remains a diplomatic matter or becomes a criminal investigation. Minister Santos looked around the room at 11 sets of eyes that held varying degrees of anger, suspicion, and calculation. His shoulders slumped as the weight of his exposure settled on him. I never intended for it to go this far, he said quietly in Portuguese. Sarah translated for the room. He says he never intended for it to go this far. Then he can help us make sure it doesn't. Ambassador Chen replied grimly. As Swiss security personnel arrived to escort Minister Santos away, the remaining delegates began the complex process of determining how much intelligence had been compromised
and what countermeasures were needed to protect their ongoing response to the financial attacks. Sarah returned to her reception desk, where she began preparing detailed briefing documents that would help 11 governments understand exactly how close they had come to having their most sensitive security operations completely undermined. But as she worked, she reflected on the strange irony that had just unfolded. For 8 years she had prevented international crises by remaining invisible and letting others take credit for solutions. Today, for the first time, she had been forced to step into the light. And in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the most effective way to remain invisible was to hide in plain sight, as someone so remarkable that people couldn't quite believe she was real. 3 days later, newspapers around the world reported that a technical glitch had postponed an international trade summit in Geneva. The brief delay had allowed security experts to upgrade communication systems before the talks resumed successfully. No mention was made of the Brazilian trade minister, who had returned to Brasilia for medical reasons, or of the sophisticated international intelligence operation that had been unraveled by a receptionist who spoke 12 languages. And no one outside that conference room would ever know that World War III had been prevented not by armies or weapons, but by a woman who had spent 8 years being underestimated by everyone who should have known better. 6 months later, when the global financial attacks were finally traced to their source and neutralized through coordinated international action, Sarah received a commendation that would never appear in any public record. It simply read, "For exceptional service in the field of international crisis prevention." She framed it and hung it in her apartment, where it remained the only evidence that Sarah Martinez, receptionist, was actually done. Sarah Lena Vasquez Chen, the most effective intelligence operative that nobody had ever heard of. And the next Monday morning she returned to her desk at the International Embassy, answered phones in perfect English, and continued the work of preventing conflicts that most people would never know had threatened to destroy everything they cared about. Because some wars are won not by fighting but by understanding. And sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is simply the ability to hear what others think you cannot understand. From which city in the world are you watching this story unfold? If you believe that understanding different languages and cultures can change the world, let us know in the comments. And if you think stories about the hidden power of communication deserve to be told, subscribe to discover more accounts of the remarkable people who keep our world running from behind the scenes. Because in every office, in every embassy, in every place where people from different cultures meet, there are individuals whose true capabilities remain hidden beneath carefully constructed facades. The question isn't whether they exist, it's whether we're wise enough to recognize them before we need them most.